The morning sun cast long shadows across Paris Island as Margaret Wells adjusted the sleeve of her modest blue dress, carefully ensuring it covered the thin white scar on her left wrist. At 56, she had mastered the art of blending in. Nothing about her appearance suggested anything more remarkable than a middle-aged mother arriving to watch her son graduate from Marine Corps basic training. Her silver-streaked brown hair was pulled back in a simple bun, sensible low heels clicked against the pavement as she walked, and the small American flag pin on her lapel was identical to those worn by dozens of other proud parents making their way toward the parade grounds. She had deliberately chosen to look ordinary today. This was Michael's moment, not hers. "First time at Paris Island?" asked a friendly woman who fell into step beside her. Margaret smiled politely. "Yes, though my son has told me quite a bit about it in his letters." "My Tommy says it's the toughest thing he's ever done," the woman continued. "I'm Linda, by the way." "Margaret," she replied, omitting her last name out of long-ingrained habit. "And yes, I believe my Michael would say the same." They walked together toward the bleachers being rapidly filled by excited families. The parade grounds stretched before them, immaculate and imposing, flags snapping in the coastal breeze. Marine staff moved with precision around the edges, preparing for the ceremony. "Do you have family history in the Marines?" Linda asked. Margaret hesitated for just a fraction of a second. No, not the Marines specifically. It wasn't exactly a lie. Her service hadn't been with the Marine Corps. Finding seats halfway up the bleachers, Margaret settled in, positioning herself where she could see clearly but wouldn't be too noticeable among the crowd. She opened the ceremony program, studying the list of graduates while continuing light conversation with Linda. Her eyes found Michael's name. Wells, Michael T. Pride swelled in her chest, tempered by a complex mixture of other emotions she kept carefully controlled. Her son had chosen this path entirely on his own. She had been careful never to influence him one way or another when it came to military service. "There's my Tommy," Linda said, pointing to a young Marine in the distance as the graduates began assembling in formation. "Third row, fifth from the right." Margaret smiled at the woman's excitement, then scanned the formations until she found Michael. Even at this distance, she could see how the 13 weeks of training had transformed him. He stood taller, his posture impeccable, face forward with the disciplined bearing of a Marine. "They look so different than when they left, don't they?" Linda remarked. "They do," Margaret agreed quietly. Michael had left home a boy and would return a Marine. It was a transformation she understood intimately, though from a very different perspective. As more families filled the bleachers, Margaret's practiced eye swept across the parade ground, identifying officers by their insignia, noting security positions, automatically cataloging details most civilians would never notice. Old habits, impossible to break even after all these years. A group of officers emerged from a nearby building, moving toward the reviewing stand. Margaret recognized the base commander from his photograph in the program. Behind him followed several other officers, including a captain whose face she couldn't quite see from this angle. The ceremony would begin soon. Margaret adjusted her sleeve again, making sure the scar remained covered. Today was about Michael, nothing else mattered. Her mind drifted back to 13 weeks ago when she had dropped him off at the recruiting station. He had been so determined, so proud to follow what he believed was a family tradition of Army service, the story she had allowed him to believe. "Mom, I'll make you proud," he had said, hugging her goodbye. "I'm already proud," she had replied, meaning it more than he could know. The truth was far more complicated than the simplified family history Michael had grown up hearing. He believed his late father had been an Army sergeant who died in a training accident before Michael was born, and that Margaret had served as an Army nurse before leaving the service to raise him alone. Simple, believable, false. The band began playing, pulling Margaret from her thoughts. The ceremony was starting. She straightened in her seat, focusing on the present moment. This was Michael's day. The past could remain where it belonged, buried like so much else in her life. As the base commander approached the microphone, Margaret allowed herself a small, genuine smile. Whatever complicated truths lay in her history, one thing was absolutely real: her pride in the young man her son had become. The mother beside her wiped away tears as the national anthem began. Margaret stood with perfect posture, her right hand placed precisely over her heart. a motion performed with the unconscious precision of someone who had done it countless times under much more formal circumstances than these. Today, she was just another proud parent, just Margaret Wells, single mother watching her only son graduate from Marine Corps training, nothing more. She was determined to keep it that way. The graduation ceremony progressed with military precision. Speeches were delivered, awards presented, and the gathered families watched with pride as the young Marines stood at attention under the bright morning sun. Margaret observed it all with a particular appreciation for the tradition and discipline on display. From her seat in the bleachers, she could see Michael clearly now, standing tall in the 3rd platoon. The transformation in him was even more apparent up close, not just physically, though he had certainly become leaner and stronger during his training. There was a new confidence in his bearing, a sense of purpose that reminded her painfully of someone else. "They're so grown up," Linda whispered beside her, dabbing at her eyes again. "It feels like yesterday they were little boys." Margaret nodded, allowing herself a small smile. "They'll always be our little boys, no matter how tall they stand." The base commander was introducing the reviewing officer now, a decorated colonel who would address the graduates. As he spoke, Margaret found her attention drawn to the captain standing near the edge of the stage, the same one she had noticed earlier. Something about him seemed vaguely familiar, though she couldn't place him from this distance. Turning her attention back to the ceremony, Margaret listened as the colonel spoke about duty, honor, and the proud tradition of the United States Marine Corps. His words resonated with her in ways the other parents couldn't possibly understand. "These young men and women join a legacy that stretches back to 1775, the colonel was saying. "They stand on the shoulders of generations of Marines who have defended our nation in every clime and place." Margaret's mind drifted despite her best efforts to stay present. 28 years ago, she had stood at attention during her own ceremony, though under very different circumstances. Not on these parade grounds, but in a secure facility where no families had been present. No proud parents watching as she graduated from a program that officially didn't exist. The memory surfaced unwanted. The small, austere room where 12 recruits, 9 men and 3 women, had received their assignments after completing the most grueling training program ever devised. The stern faces of their instructors, the weight of the responsibilities they were assuming, and the knowledge that many of them wouldn't survive the decade. "Mom, are you okay?" a voice asked, pulling Margaret from the memory. She turned to find her daughter, Emily, sliding into the seat beside her. At 24, Emily was the spitting image of Margaret in her youth, the same determined chin, the same observant eyes. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Margaret replied, squeezing her daughter's hand. "Just lost in thought. I'm glad you made it." "Sorry I'm late. The flight from Boston was delayed." Emily glanced toward the parade ground. "Did I miss anything?" "Just speeches. They haven't dismissed the graduates yet." Emily studied her mother's face. "You look tired. Did you sleep at all last night?" "Enough," Margaret assured her, though it wasn't entirely true. She had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling of her hotel room, wrestling with memories and doubts. When Michael had announced his intention to join the Marines, Margaret had been supportive but neutral, careful not to reveal the complex emotions his choice had triggered. She had never wanted her children to follow in her footsteps, had done everything in her power to give them normal, civilian lives. Yet here they were at Paris Island, watching Michael take his first steps down a path that paralleled her own more closely than he could possibly know. The colonel concluded his speech, and the command to dismiss the graduates rang out across the parade ground. A cheer went up from the crowd as the formation dissolved, new Marines breaking ranks to find their families. "There he is," Emily said, pointing. Michael was scanning the bleachers, searching for them. When he spotted his mother and sister, a grin broke across his serious face. He made his way toward them, moving with the confident stride of a Marine. Margaret and Emily descended from the bleachers to meet him. When he reached them, Michael swept his mother into a tight embrace. "You did it," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." "Thanks, Mom," Michael replied, his own voice suspiciously hoarse. "It means everything that you're both here." As they embraced, Margaret noticed Michael's drill instructor watching from a distance, his face impassive. It was a look she recognized, the careful assessment of a recruit's family, forming impressions of the influences that had shaped the young person under their command. Private Wells performed admirably during training, a voice said from behind them. Margaret turned to find the captain she had noticed earlier standing nearby. Up close, she could see he was in his early 40s, with the weathered look of someone who had seen multiple deployments. His name tape read Harrison. "Captain," Michael said, immediately standing straighter. "At ease," Harrison said with a slight smile. "I just wanted to congratulate you personally. Your marksmanship scores were exceptional, some of the best I've seen." "Thank you, sir," Michael replied, clearly pleased by the recognition. "He gets that from his grandfather," Margaret said automatically, maintaining the family story. "He was an excellent shot." Captain Harrison's eyes shifted to Margaret, studying her face with a slightly puzzled expression, as if trying to place her. "Ma'am, have we met before?" "I don't believe so, Captain," Margaret replied evenly, her heart rate increasing slightly despite her calm exterior. "I'm Margaret Wells." "Captain James Harrison," he replied, extending his hand. Margaret shook it, careful to keep her sleeve in place as she did. "Thank you for taking an interest in my son's progress." Harrison nodded, still looking at her with that puzzled expression. "There's something familiar about you. Were you ever stationed at Quantico?" "No," Margaret said with a polite smile. "I was an Army nurse, but that was many years ago. I've been a civilian hospital administrator since before my children were born." This seemed to satisfy him, though he still looked thoughtful. "Well, you raised a fine Marine, Mrs. Wells. You should be proud." "I am," she replied simply. Harrison turned back to Michael. "Private, enjoy your graduation liberty with your family. Your platoon sergeant has your reporting instructions for after leave." "Yes, sir, thank you, sir." As Harrison walked away, Emily linked her arm through her mother's. "He seemed impressed with you, little brother." Michael grinned. Captain Harrison oversees marksmanship training. Getting recognition from him is a big deal. "We should celebrate," Margaret said, deliberately changing the subject. "I made reservations at that restaurant you mentioned in your letters." As they walked toward the parking area, Michael proudly pointing out features of the base to his sister, Margaret found her thoughts returning to Captain Harrison. There was something familiar about him, too, though she couldn't place where they might have crossed paths. After 20 years of maintaining her cover as Margaret Wells, hospital administrator and single mother, she had learned to be cautious about unexpected connections to her past. Most of the people who had known her in her previous life were either dead or still working in the shadows themselves. The chances of a random Marine captain recognizing her were slim. Still, as they reached her car, Margaret found herself glancing back toward the parade ground, a sense of unease settling over her despite the joyful occasion. The past had a way of surfacing when least expected, and Margaret had more past to hide than most. The celebration lunch was everything Michael had hoped for: good food, family togetherness, and the chance to share stories of his training experiences. He had visibly matured during his 13 weeks at Paris Island, speaking with new confidence about his upcoming assignments and the friends he had made among his fellow Marines. "So what's next?" Emily asked as they finished their desserts. "You mentioned specialized training." "Infantry school at Camp Jiger," Michael replied. "Then hopefully Scout Sniper School if my scores stay high enough." Margaret kept her expression neutral, though her heart skipped at the words Scout Sniper. Of course Michael would excel at marksmanship. It was quite literally in his blood, though not in the way he believed. "Captain Harrison seemed impressed with your shooting," she remarked, keeping her tone casual. Michael nodded enthusiastically. "He oversees the marksmanship program for the whole base. He actually came to observe our final qualification, which almost never happens. The DIs said he was specifically watching me and 2 others who had perfect scores." "That's my little brother," Emily said, ruffling his close-cropped hair. "Always showing off." Michael ducked away, laughing. "Knock it off, Em, I'm a Marine now." "You'll always be my annoying little brother, Marine or not." Margaret smiled at their banter, grateful for this moment of normalcy. Tomorrow Michael would begin his 10 days of leave before reporting to Camp Jiger, and they would all fly home to Cincinnati together. For now, they could simply enjoy being a family, celebrating this milestone. "We should head back to the hotel so you can change," Margaret suggested, checking her watch. "The graduation dinner at the officers' club starts at 7. The dinner was an optional event where new Marines and their families could mingle with the training staff in a more relaxed setting. Michael had been eager to attend, proud to introduce his family to his drill instructors and peers. Back at the hotel, as Michael and Emily got ready, Margaret stood alone on the balcony of her room, gazing out at the distant shape of Paris Island across the water. She found herself thinking of Captain Harrison again, troubled by the nagging sense of recognition. She absently rubbed her left wrist, feeling the raised line of the scar beneath her sleeve. 23 years had passed since she'd received that mark, along with a small tattoo beside it that identified her unit. The tattoo had been removed years ago, part of her transition to civilian life, but the scar remained, a permanent reminder of a life she had left behind. A light knock on the connecting door interrupted her thoughts. "Mom, are you ready?" Emily called. Margaret smoothed her navy blue evening dress, checked once more that her sleeves were properly arranged, and opened the door. Emily stood there in a simple black dress, while Michael was resplendent in his dress blues. "Don't you look handsome?" Margaret said, straightening his already perfect collar in a maternal gesture that made him roll his eyes. "Mom, it took me ages to get this uniform perfect. Please don't mess it up." She smiled, stepping back to admire him properly. "You look every inch a Marine, Michael. Your father would have been so proud." The words came automatically, part of the fiction she had maintained for over 20 years. Sometimes Margaret almost believed it herself, the story of the Army sergeant husband who had died before Michael was born, leaving her to raise their children alone. The truth was far more complicated and far more dangerous. "Ready?" Michael asked, offering each woman an arm with exaggerated gallantry. The officers' club was elegantly decorated for the graduation dinner, with Marine Corps flags flanking the entrance and staff in dress uniforms greeting arrivals. Inside, new Marines and their families mingled with officers and drill instructors in a celebration that temporarily bridged the usually strict hierarchy. As they entered, Margaret immediately conducted a subtle scan of the room, nodding exits, identifying senior officers, assessing potential threats. The habit was so ingrained she didn't even realize she was doing it until she caught Emily watching her with a puzzled expression. "Everything okay, Mom?" Emily asked quietly. "Of course," Margaret replied, forcing herself to relax, just taking in the scene. Michael was already being waved over by a group of his fellow graduates, eager to introduce their families to one another. Margaret and Emily followed, soon engaged in conversation with other proud parents swapping stories of their Marines' journeys. Across the room, Margaret spotted Captain Harrison in conversation with several other officers. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, meeting her eyes briefly before returning to his discussion. Something about his posture suggested he was still trying to place her, and the thought made her uneasy. "Private Wells," called a voice, and they turned to find Michael's drill instructor approaching. "Glad you could make it, Marine." "Staff Sergeant Martinez," Michael replied with respect. "I'd like you to meet my mother and sister." Martinez shook their hands, his severe training field demeanor softened for the occasion. "Mrs. Wells, you should be proud. Your son was one of the standouts in his platoon." "I am very proud," Margaret assured him, "and grateful to you for helping shape him into a Marine." As they chatted, Margaret found herself gradually relaxing. Perhaps she was being paranoid about Harrison. After all, 23 years was a long time, and she had changed considerably since then. Her hair, once dark brown, now showed substantial silver. Lines had formed at the corners of her eyes and mouth. Even her posture and gait had been deliberately altered over the years to match her civilian cover. The evening progressed pleasantly. Michael introduced them to what seemed like dozens of fellow Marines, all nearly indistinguishable to Margaret in their identical uniforms, but clearly individuals her son had come to know well during their shared ordeal. Eventually, Emily excused herself to visit the restroom, and Michael was pulled away by friends, leaving Margaret momentarily alone. She moved toward one of the large windows overlooking the parade ground, now quiet and empty in the evening light. "Mrs. Wells." The voice behind her sent a chill down her spine, not because of who it was, but because of the tone. It was Captain Harrison, but the puzzled curiosity from earlier had been replaced by something else entirely. Recognition. Certainty. Margaret turned slowly, maintaining her composed expression through decades of training. Captain Harrison, it's been a lovely evening, hasn't it? Harrison's face showed complex emotions, shock, disbelief, and something that might have been awe. I've been trying to place you all day, he said quietly. You reminded me of someone, but I couldn't figure out who until just now. Margaret said nothing, waiting. Around them, the party continued, no one paying attention to their quiet conversation by the window. I was deployed to Afghanistan in 2003, Harrison continued, his voice low. Task Force Sierra, I was just a lieutenant then. The name of the task force confirmed Margaret's fears. Harrison had been there. I think you may be confusing me with someone else, Captain, she said calmly. I've never been to Afghanistan. Harrison shook his head slightly. I didn't think so either until I saw you reach for your water glass during dinner. His eyes dropped meaningfully to her left wrist, where her sleeve had apparently ridden up just enough. That scar is distinctive, and I never forget a face, even after 20 years. Margaret automatically adjusted her sleeve, though it was too late. Captain. You were there, he said, no longer a question but a statement of fact. Mazari Sharif, the hostage extraction operation. You led the team that got us out when everything went sideways. Margaret's mind raced through possible responses. Denial seemed pointless now. Harrison had seen enough to be certain. That operation is still classified, she said quietly, effectively confirming his suspicion. Harrison stared at her, still processing the revelation. They told us you were killed when the second building collapsed. There was a memorial at Bagram. That was the official story, Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. It needed to be. Your echo, he said, using the call sign she hadn't heard in over 2 decades. Captain Margaret Reed, Special Activities Division. You pulled 4 of us out under fire, including me with a bullet in your shoulder, and that. He nodded toward her covered wrist from the restraints. Margaret glanced around, ensuring no one was within earshot. Captain Harrison, this conversation isn't appropriate for this setting. My apologies, he said immediately, military discipline reasserting itself. It's a shock. You saved my life. Before Margaret could respond, she spotted Michael making his way toward them through the crowd, Emily beside him. Her children, who knew nothing of Captain Reed or Task Force Sierra or the night in Afghanistan that had officially ended that woman's existence. Is everything okay? Michael asked as he reached them, looking between his mother and the captain with curiosity. Everything's fine, Margaret assured him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Captain Harrison was just telling me more about the marksmanship program. Harrison recovered quickly, shifting to a casual tone. Your mother was asking about your exceptional scores, Private. I was explaining our advanced training opportunities. Michael beamed with pride, completely missing the tension between the adults. The captain thinks I might have a shot at Scout Sniper School, Mom. That's wonderful, Margaret replied automatically, her mind still reeling from the confrontation. If you'll excuse me, Harrison said, with a meaningful glance at Margaret, I need to speak with the colonel. Private Wells, Mrs. Wells, Miss Wells, enjoy the remainder of your evening. As he walked away, Emily leaned closer to her mother. What was that about? He looked like he'd seen a ghost. Nothing important, Margaret assured her, though her pulse was racing. Michael, why don't you show us that display of historical Marine Corps photographs you mentioned? We should make the most of our time before heading back to the hotel. As they moved away from the window, Margaret caught Harrison watching her from across the room, his expression still showing disbelief. She had spent 23 years carefully maintaining her new identity, raising her children in peaceful anonymity, the truth of her past locked away where it couldn't touch them. Now, with a chance encounter and a moment of carelessness, that carefully constructed life was suddenly at risk. Captain Harrison knew who she really was, or at least who she had been. The question now was what he would do with that knowledge. And more importantly, how she would protect her children from the dangerous truth she had hidden from them their entire lives. The drive back to the hotel passed in relative silence. Michael was tired from the long day of ceremonies and celebrations, while Emily seemed to sense her mother's distraction and didn't press for conversation. Margaret's mind raced with contingency plans, habits from a life she had thought long behind her. Early flight tomorrow, right? Michael asked as they reached the hotel lobby. 900, Margaret confirmed. We should be back in Cincinnati by early afternoon. Michael nodded, stifling a yawn. I think I'll turn in. It's been a long day. Of course, Margaret said, embracing her son. I'm so proud of you, Michael. Today was everything I could have hoped for. After saying good night to both her children, Margaret returned to her own room, immediately checking that the door was properly secured, another old habit resurging in the face of potential threat. She paced the small space, considering her options. Harrison had recognized her. After 23 years living as Margaret Wells, her cover had been compromised by a chance encounter and a momentary carelessness with her sleeve. The question was whether he posed a genuine threat to the life she had built. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Margaret approached the door cautiously, checking the peephole to find Emily standing in the hallway. She opened the door. "Can't sleep?" Margaret asked. Emily entered, her expression concerned. "Mom, what's going on? You've been acting strange ever since that captain talked to you." Margaret considered deflecting, as she had done countless times when questions about her past arose. But Emily was perceptive, always had been, and too old now to be easily misled. "It's complicated, sweetie," Margaret said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Something from a long time ago." Emily sat beside her. "Does it have to do with Dad, the real story, I mean?" Margaret looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Mom, I'm 24, Emily said gently. "I've suspected for years that the story about Dad being an Army sergeant who died in a training accident wasn't entirely true." For a moment, Margaret couldn't speak. She had maintained the fiction for so long, had been so careful with the details, creating a paper trail that would withstand casual scrutiny. "What made you suspect?" she finally asked. Emily shrugged. "Little things, the way you sometimes slip into a different posture when you think no one's watching, how you always scan rooms when we enter, the fact that there are no photos of Dad in uniform, even though you said he was career military." Margaret felt a complex mixture of pride in her daughter's perception and fear of where this conversation might lead. "Have you shared these thoughts with Michael?" "No," Emily assured her. "He believes the story completely. He joined the Marines partly because he thought it would connect him to the father he never knew." The irony of that statement wasn't lost on Margaret. Michael had indeed followed in his father's footsteps, just not in the way he believed. Before she could decide how much to reveal, another knock came at the door, harder and more insistent than Emily's had been. Margaret tensed, moving automatically to position herself between the door and her daughter. "Mrs. Wells," Captain Harrison's voice called from the hallway. "I need to speak with you, it's important." Emily gave her mother a questioning look. Margaret hesitated only briefly before moving to open the door. Harrison stood in the hallway, still in his dress uniform but with signs of haste in his appearance. "Captain," Margaret said coolly, "this is unexpected." "I apologize for the intrusion," he replied, his expression serious. "But we need to talk privately." Margaret glanced at Emily, then back to Harrison. "My daughter is aware that there are complications. In my past, you can speak freely." Harrison entered, closing the door behind him. "Mrs. Wells, or should I say Captain Reed, we have a situation. After recognizing you, I made some discreet inquiries through secure channels." "That was unwise," Margaret said, her voice taking on a hardness Emily had never heard before. "Perhaps, but necessary," Harrison continued. "Your official status is still listed as KIA, but there's a protocol for verification inquiries that triggered an alert. I've just received word that 2 individuals identifying themselves as Defense Intelligence Agency are on their way to interview me about my inquiry." Margaret's expression didn't change, but Emily could see tension in her mother's shoulders. "When?" "Tomorrow morning. They're flying in from Washington tonight." "I see." Margaret's mind was already calculating. Their flight was at 900, potentially early enough to be gone before the DIA representatives arrived, but it would be close. "Mom, what's going on?" Emily asked, confusion and concern evident in her voice. Margaret took a deep breath, looking at her daughter with sadness and resolve. "Emily, the story I've told you and Michael about your father and my past, it wasn't entirely accurate." "I figured that much," Emily said with remarkable composure. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" "Not trouble exactly," Margaret replied carefully. "But there are people who would have questions if they knew Margaret Wells was once someone else." Harrison stepped forward. Your mother saved my life and the lives of 3 other servicemen during an operation in Afghanistan in 2003. She was reported killed in action afterward, which apparently was administrative rather than factual. Emily stared at her mother. You were in Afghanistan as what? Margaret sat down beside her daughter, taking her hands. I wasn't an army nurse, Emily. I was an intelligence officer with a special unit. The operation Captain Harrison mentioned was my last. For reasons I still can't fully explain, it was necessary for Margaret Reed to be officially declared dead afterward. And our father, Emily asked quietly. Was a Marine, Margaret admitted. Major Thomas Winters. We worked together on several operations. He really did die before you and Michael were born, though not in a training accident. The revelation hung in the air between them. Emily's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of the complex emotion that comes with finally hearing a long-suspected truth. Does this mean you're in danger now? She asked. I don't think so, Margaret replied, looking to Harrison for confirmation. I don't believe there's any hostile intent, Harrison agreed. But there would certainly be questions, investigations, possibly even legal complications regarding your official status and benefits. And it would expose Michael and Emily to scrutiny they don't deserve, Margaret added. They've had normal lives, untouched by the world I left behind. I want to keep it that way. Harrison nodded, understanding. I have an idea that might help. The DIA representatives won't arrive until 800 tomorrow. Your flight is at 900. I can delay my meeting with them, give you time to be gone before they start asking questions. And then what? Margaret asked. They'll just follow us to Cincinnati. Not if they believe my initial inquiry was mistaken, Harrison suggested. I can tell them I was confused, that upon reflection I realized Mrs. Wells couldn't possibly be the person I initially thought she was. Margaret considered this. They might not believe you. Perhaps not entirely, but it would introduce doubt. Enough doubt that they might decide not to pursue an investigation into a 20-year-old administrative matter regarding someone who's lived as a law-abiding civilian for decades. The room fell silent as Margaret weighed their options. Emily watched her mother, seeing her in an entirely new light. Not just the strong, loving parent she had always known, but a woman with a past far more complex and dangerous than she had imagined. Why would you help us like this? Margaret finally asked Harrison. You'd be risking your career. Harrison's expression softened. Because I've spent 20 years believing the person who saved my life died for us. Finding out you survived, that you built a life and raised a family, it feels like a second chance to express my gratitude. He straightened, his decision made. I'll handle the DIA representatives. You take your family home tomorrow as planned. If anyone asks later, I'll say I made a mistake. The resemblance was striking, but upon reflection, it couldn't have been you. And if they don't believe you, Margaret pressed, then I'll tell them exactly what happened in Mazar-e Sharif, how you continued the mission despite being wounded, how you got us out when everything went wrong, and how the last time I saw you, you were heading back into a burning building to save more hostages. Harrison's voice carried absolute conviction. I'll tell them that whatever administrative decision was made to list you as KIA, you earned the right to your life afterward. Margaret studied him, assessing his sincerity and capability. Finally, she nodded. Thank you, Captain. No thanks necessary, Captain Reed, he replied formally. I'm still repaying a debt. After Harrison left, Emily sat in stunned silence for several moments, processing everything she had heard. So you were, what, a spy? She finally asked. Margaret smiled faintly. Intelligence officer is the preferred term, but yes, something like that. And Dad was a Marine major. Yes, one of the finest I ever knew. Emily shook her head in wonder. Does this mean Michael actually does take after him, with the marksmanship and everything? More than he knows, Margaret admitted. Thomas was a scout sniper before becoming an intelligence officer. It seems some talents run in the blood. Should we tell Michael? Emily asked. Margaret considered this carefully. Not yet. Let him enjoy his achievement without complications. There will be time later when he's settled to share the truth about his father. Some of it anyway. Emily nodded, then suddenly embraced her mother tightly. I always knew you were extraordinary, Mom. I just didn't realize how much. Margaret returned the embrace, tears threatening for the first time that day. Everything I've done, the person I became, the life I built, it was all for you and Michael. That part was never a lie. Later, after Emily had returned to her room, Margaret stood by the window, looking out at the distant lights of Paris Island where her son had just graduated, and where, in an unexpected twist of fate, her past had finally caught up with her. The wrist mark that had given her away was aching slightly, a phantom pain from a wound long healed. She rubbed it absently, remembering the operation in Afghanistan, the desperate fight to free hostages, the moment when the building had collapsed, giving her the opportunity to disappear and begin a new life. Captain Reed had died that day, as far as the official record was concerned. Margaret Wells had been born from the ashes, a mother determined to protect her children from the dangerous world their parents had navigated. Now, thanks to Captain Harrison's unexpected loyalty, she might be able to preserve that life a little longer. Michael would continue his Marine career, perhaps even become a scout sniper like the father he had never known. Emily would return to medical school, pursuing her own path, and Margaret would go back to Cincinnati, to her job at the hospital, to the quiet life she had built so carefully. But something had changed today. A door had opened that couldn't be fully closed again. Emily now knew at least part of the truth. Eventually, Michael would need to know as well. And somewhere in Washington, a file would be updated, noting a possible sighting of a woman long presumed dead. Margaret touched the scar on her wrist, the mark that had betrayed her after all these years. Some wounds never fully healed, some secrets never stayed buried forever, but she had faced worse odds before and survived. Tomorrow, they would board their flight home as planned. Margaret Wells would continue her life as a hospital administrator and single mother, and Captain Margaret Reed would remain a ghost, a memory honored by those few who knew the truth of her sacrifice and survival. She had only come to watch her son graduate. Despite the unexpected complication, that's exactly what she had done. The rest would be dealt with as it had always been, one careful, deliberate step at a time.